Welcome to True Crime Threads. Today we uncover the horrifying massacre of a family on Diwali night. It was Diwali, the festival of lights, and the Sharma family had been preparing for the most memorable night of the year. Their home, nestled on the outskirts of a quiet town, was beautifully decorated with vibrant lanterns, colorful rangolis, and the sweet fragrances of traditional foods that filled the air. Jia, the youngest, eagerly helped her mother, Riva, in the kitchen, mixing ingredients for the sweets they would share with neighbors later. The warmth of the house, both from the oven and the love of family, created a feeling of peace and togetherness. Meanwhile, her father, Vikram, worked outside setting up firecrackers, carefully arranging them in neat rows along the driveway. Ishani and Dhruv, the older siblings, laughed and joked about the family's Diwali traditions, debating who would get to light the biggest cracker this year. The evening air was crisp, but the warmth inside the house made everyone feel cozy. The whole family had been eagerly looking forward to this night for weeks, as it marked the culmination of a month-long celebration. The house was filled with the sounds of chatter and laughter, the children running through the halls with sparklers in hand, their faces lighting up with excitement. As the night wore on, the house became more and more alive with the joy of Diwali. The smell of fresh sweets mingled with the scent of incense, and the glow from the thousands of diyas small oil lamps filled the home with a soft, golden light. Outside, the first of the fireworks began to burst into the sky, their bright flashes lighting up the night. Jia's eyes sparkled as she held a sparkler in her hand, twirling it around, her small figure surrounded by bursts of light. She ran out to show her parents, who beamed with pride. The festive energy in the house seemed to create a protective barrier around the Sharma family. Everything was perfect. Riva's eyes glistened with happiness as she watched her children, so full of life, laughing and enjoying each other's company. But even as they reveled in the evening's festivities, a subtle unease lingered in the background, unnoticed by the family. Little did they know, this night of celebration would soon turn into a nightmare. As the evening grew later and the family gathered in the living room to light the final set of firecrackers, the laughter and light-heartedness began to fade, replaced by an unsettling feeling that something wasn't right. Ansh, the middle child, had grown distant throughout the night, choosing to retreat to his room instead of participating in the fun. His absence went unnoticed at first, but as time passed, Jia, Ishani, and Dhruv tried to find him, knocking on his door. When there was no answer, they assumed he had gone to meet his friends and continued with their celebrations. However, as the night wore on, the shadows deepened, and the atmosphere in the Sharma household began to change. As the night deepened, the Sharma family continued to enjoy the festivities, unaware of the growing tension that surrounded them. The sounds of crackers and fireworks filled the air, blending with the laughter and chatter from the family. Yet, an undercurrent of unease began to creep in. Ansh, who had been distant for most of the evening, had left the house without explanation. At first, no one thought much of it, assuming he had gone to visit friends or was simply taking a break from the noise and chaos. However, as the hours passed and he failed to return, the concern started to grow. Ishani, the eldest sibling, was the first to notice that Ansh was missing. She had gone to his room to invite him to join the family outside, but the door was locked, and there was no answer when she knocked. Dhruv and Jia also tried calling out to him, but there was still no response. The family's concern grew when they realized he hadn't been seen for hours, and his phone remained unanswered. Vikram and Riva exchanged worried glances. Something didn't feel right, but they brushed off their concerns, assuming Ansh had simply gone out with friends, a typical behavior for a teenager seeking a bit of independence. However, the night's festivities carried on without him, and the family tried to distract themselves with the last round of fireworks and family games. Riva, trying to keep things light, suggested they start lighting sparklers, hoping the sight of the glowing lights would bring some cheer back into the evening. But Ansh's absence loomed larger in the background. As the clock ticked on, the sound of fireworks began to fade, and a heavy silence replaced the merriment. Riva and Vikram took turns checking on the rest of the house, searching for their son. They ventured into the garden, the garage, and the backyard, calling out his name. Yet, there was no sign of him. As the minutes turned into hours, the worry began to feel more like dread. Ansh had never disappeared for this long without telling anyone. They considered calling the police, but something made Vikram hesitate. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, but without any solid evidence, he didn't want to overreact. Just as they were about to call it a night, there was a sudden, sharp noise from the direction of the storage room. It was a loud crash, as if something heavy had fallen. Vikram, Dhruv, and Ishani rushed toward the sound, their hearts pounding. Riva stayed behind with Jia, her anxiety growing with each passing second. The tension was palpable, and the air felt thick, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The investigation into the crash would uncover the horrifying reality, one that would shatter the Sharma family's Diwali night and change their lives forever. The clock struck midnight. The joyous sounds of fireworks that had filled the night air suddenly stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to envelop the house. The family's laughter had died down, and only the soft hum of the fridge and the occasional rustle of wind outside could be heard. Then, a loud crash echoed from the direction of the storage room at the back of the house. Vikram, Dhruv, and Ishani jumped at the noise, instantly on high alert. It wasn't like the usual clatter of the house settling, this was something more disturbing. Without a second thought, they sprang into action, rushing toward the sound. Riva stayed with Jia in the living room, the unease settling into a knot in her stomach as she stared at the empty space where Ansh should have been. The house was dark, with only the faint glow of the streetlights filtering in through the windows. As they neared the storage room, the smell of something metallic filled the air. Blood. Vikram's heart skipped a beat, and his steps faltered. He pushed the door open slowly, the creak of the hinges louder than ever in the silence. Inside, the room was a mess, with scattered boxes and broken items strewn across the floor. But what they saw next left them frozen in shock. Blood was splattered across the walls, and there was a trail leading from the door toward the back of the room. Ansh was gone. Panic surged through Vikram's chest as he scanned the room for any sign of their son. The mess in the room seemed out of place. There was no way Ansh could have been involved in this destruction. It didn't make sense. As his eyes moved toward the back of the storage room, he noticed something else: Ansh's phone lying abandoned on the floor, cracked screen facing up. It was the only sign that he had been there. Vikram picked it up, his hands trembling. There was no sign of Ansh anywhere, and the sight of his phone only deepened the confusion and fear. What had happened to him? Why had he left his phone behind? And why was there blood in the room? Meanwhile, Ishani and Dhruv searched the rest of the house, calling Ansh's name in frantic tones, but there was no answer. The house was eerily quiet, the absence of their son now palpable and chilling. It was clear something had gone terribly wrong, but no one could piece together the events leading up to this moment. Riva's worry turned to dread as she stood in the living room, her eyes fixed on the door, half expecting Ansh to walk in and explain everything. But there was nothing. The door to the storage room was left open, and the sounds of the family searching were drowned out by the sinking realization that something far darker than they could imagine was unfolding. The night had begun as a celebration, but now it was spiraling into a nightmare they couldn't escape. The family had only moments to react. As Vikram, Dhruv, and Ishani stood frozen in the storage room, the full gravity of the situation began to sink in. The room was in disarray, the bloodstains chilling in their stark contrast against the bright, festive decorations that adorned the rest of the house. There was no sign of Ansh, and the unsettling discovery of his phone lying abandoned on the floor seemed to confirm their worst fears: something terrible had happened. Vikram's heart raced as he quickly scanned the room. The door to the storage room stood wide open, and the room was colder than it should have been. He felt a surge of panic but forced himself to stay focused. Ishani and Dhruv moved swiftly through the house, calling Ansh's name, their voices growing more frantic with each passing second. But there was no answer. The house, once filled with laughter and the sounds of celebration, now felt heavy and suffocating. It was as though an invisible presence loomed over them, pressing down with a sense of impending doom. Riva, growing increasingly anxious, stayed with Jia in the living room, her face pale and filled with worry. The two women had no idea what was happening, but the air in the house had changed, and the silence was deafening. They could feel something terrible was unfolding, but they had no way of knowing just how close they were to unraveling the nightmare. As the rest of the family searched the house, the front door, which had been left unlocked in the frenzy of the celebration, slammed shut with a loud thud, startling everyone. The sound echoed through the hallways, sending a wave of fear through the group. Vikram rushed to the door and tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The lock had somehow jammed. Panic set in as he pulled harder on the handle, but the door refused to open. They were trapped. The family's worst nightmare was now a reality. The peaceful home they had once known was now a death trap. No matter how hard they tried to open the door, it was as though something or someone was preventing them from leaving. It wasn't just the physical barrier, it was the sense of being watched, of being hunted. Each shadow in the corners of the house seemed to grow darker, each creak of the floorboards amplified in the stillness. Vikram's mind raced. They needed to find Ansh. They needed to understand what had happened. But something told him that time was running out, and with every passing second, the danger grew. Then, just as he was about to return to the others, the phone rang. His heart skipped a beat as he rushed to answer it. The voice on the other end wasn't Ansh's. It was deep, gruff, and filled with menace. "You're already too late," the voice said, sending a chill down Vikram's spine. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. It was a threat, but it was more than that. It was the sound of a carefully orchestrated plan coming to its brutal conclusion. The feeling of being trapped, both physically and mentally, intensified. The nightmare had only just begun. By dawn, the horrific events of the night had left the Sharma family shattered. The house, once filled with laughter and celebration, now stood in eerie silence, with only the faint light of morning creeping through the windows. The police arrived at the scene, their presence bringing a sense of relief mixed with dread. The sight that greeted them was unlike anything they had encountered before. The family members lay dead, each one positioned carefully in different rooms of the house, as though placed with cold precision. The brutality of the act was evident, yet there was something chillingly methodical about the entire scene. The investigators immediately set to work, documenting the scene with grim efficiency. There were no signs of forced entry. The windows were intact, and all the doors had been locked from the inside. The security system had been disabled, leaving no surveillance footage to provide any answers. The only clue that could be found was Ansh's phone, which had been discarded in the storage room, along with the bloodstains that marked the path of violence through the house. But despite their best efforts, the authorities could not determine how the family had been attacked or who was behind it. The most puzzling part of the investigation was the absence of Ansh. Despite his phone being found, there was no sign of him anywhere. It was as though he had vanished from the house entirely. The police combed through the property, but they found no trace of him. His absence raised even more questions. Had he been part of the massacre? Or had he been the one to orchestrate it? As the investigation unfolded, the truth began to emerge, but it was a twisted and tragic tale. Ansh had become involved with a criminal gang, one that had promised him a way out of the financial struggles he had secretly been facing. The gang had exploited his vulnerability, manipulating him into a series of increasingly dangerous actions. It was clear that Ansh had been pressured into taking part in the massacre, but the details of his involvement remained unclear. The discovery of the gang's role in the tragedy sent shockwaves through the community. The leader of the gang, a man who had once been a trusted family friend, had played a central role in orchestrating the massacre. He had used Ansh as a pawn, manipulating him into betraying his own family for the promise of money and a new life. But it was not just about the money. The gang had targeted the Sharma family for reasons that remained shrouded in secrecy, and their motives were as twisted as the events of that fateful night. The massacre was a brutal reminder of the darkness that could lie hidden beneath the surface of even the most ordinary lives. The Sharma family's tragic end was not just the result of a random act of violence, it was the culmination of a series of choices and secrets that had been brewing for months. The community was left to pick up the pieces, but the unanswered questions lingered, leaving a chilling reminder that even the brightest moments could be tainted by the shadows lurking just out of sight.